yourself. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight to hear our graduate student Ellie Lawson present her work, which we'll get to in just a moment. My name is Nicole Newman, and I direct the Max Kade American Research and Resource Center here at IUPUI. I'd like to begin our event by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the occupied and contested territory of Native peoples. We thus wish to acknowledge and honor the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee peoples on whose ancestral homelands and resources Indiana University was built and currently occupies. I also wish to acknowledge that with its founding in 1969, IUPUI also displaced a vibrant Black community in Indianapolis. So in the spirit of supporting those communities, I'd encourage you to both attend and also financially support our Native American and Indigenous Studies programs here at IUPUI. And there's a handy Give Now button, as well as Africana Studies. They both do a lot of community outreach and are wonderful programs that I would strongly encourage you to support. They also have a Give Now button. If you would like me to email any web addresses to you, just put a little X by your name on the sign-in sheet. I'm happy to share that information with you as well. So before introducing our guests today, I just want to take a moment to introduce the Max Kade Center and also go over event protocol. The Max Kade Center connects with the community in various different ways. We give out quite a few student scholarships, and we host about 3 to 5 events per academic year on a range of topics that in some way connect to German and or German American culture. We will have a mix of events next spring. If you want to get on our mailing list, many of you are RSVP'd, but you could also put maybe a circle by your name on the sign-in sheet. And please do sign in if you haven't already. Next semester, we'll do a teacher workshop on gender neutral and inclusive language in the German language teaching at the high school and college level. We're going to have a talk by Adrian Merritt, who's a medievalist and studies comics and is a wonderful, very sort of dilettante of a German scholar. And then we will also be doing a talk with Dr. Atina Kosman, who is a renowned scholar in German studies in combination with the Bourne's Jewish Studies program that I attend. So we will send all those out on our email website. If you click on our website here, you can also check out events. We're also doing St. Nikolaus Tag at the Carmel Christkindlmarkt if you have little ones that want to meet St. Nick, who is in our midst. They're a little different. And they get little tootin full of little bags full of mandarins and chocolates and all sorts of goodies. But then we'll also post our events for next semester as well. We also are on Twitter and Facebook. So if you haven't already, please do take a moment to sign in. This helps us with our administrative duties immensely, also to prove that people come. Thank you. There's water in the back. We ask that you keep your masks on when you're not actively drinking or eating if you brought something to snack on. We do have parking garage tickets. If you parked in the Vermont garage, good for $4 off about an hour. You can see Sandy if you need one of those afterwards. She'll pass one on to you. And then for today's event, Ellie will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be followed by a Q&A. And I think this will be lively. I'm looking forward to our engaged conversation. And finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Ellie Lawson, who is a graduate student here at IUPUI in public history. In addition to a history bachelor's degree with multiple minors, refugee studies, museum studies, and communication studies, if I have that correct, a very impressive scholarly rigorous scholarly career. She also has studied at the University of Oxford. Alongside her studies, she is a project coordinator for the Indiana Jewish Historical Society collection digitization project at the IHS, or Indiana Historical Society. And she is, of course, the current recipient of the Max Kade Graduate Fellowship, and we are so proud to have her here to share her work and to support further engagement with German American studies in the state of Indiana. She is a generous and a motivated student and scholar. It's been such a pleasure to work with her the past 4 or so months. And we're excited to see how this work grows as she continues on with her master's thesis, which examines historical memory and identity in oral histories from descendants of Holocaust survivors here in central Indiana. So please join me in welcoming Ellie Lawson as she gives her talk, German American Jews during the Holocaust. Thank you, Ellie.
Well, hello. Can I take my mask off? Is it okay? Okay. We're far enough distance away from each other. Well, hello. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and get to do this. Thanks to the Max Kade Center for giving me a platform to do this research. I think it's great. And I just wanted to start off by saying I've learned so much by doing this research. And I'm continuing to learn about the Holocaust impact on Indiana and also German American culture, which I haven't really studied that much until now. So I'm excited to welcome any questions and comments after in the Q&A. And so we'll just get started. And so I think the first thing that I want to address is what is considered or who is considered German, who is considered Jewish, and then how do we get German Jewish Americans. And so when we think of modern day Germany and the map lines that we've drawn now, that doesn't really encompass what all Germanic study and culture is, especially when we're talking about immigrants that come before World War I, World War II. And so my research considers people that transcend those map drawn lines. And it considers not only place of birth, but also language and religion, social behavior, art, and music. And then when we consider who is Jewish, I think popular interpretation just defaults to religious and non-religious interpretation of Jewish people. And again, I think that needs to be transcended into studying the way that language is used in Jewish culture and identity, as well as social behaviors and just place of birth, music, things like that. And so in fact, when we think of German Jewish American identity, there's a quote by historian Joe Salmons and Christoph Mauch that says, whether religious, ethnic, or regional, identities can be best described as cultural and social constructs. They depend on concrete historical conditions, but they also are invented and imagined by individuals or groups. And so when we think of German American culture, they can be interpreted and understood within their community and and outside of their community in different ways. And so moving forward, I think that we need to move away from a single or monolithic interpretation of identity that also includes, that transcends different types of, religious or language that we might see as common or normal. So we'll move on. So the first thing I want to do is set a scene. So we're talking about the 1930s and 40s. There's two type of things that are kind of going on in the US in the 30s, kind of big things. There's a lot going on, but I wanted to highlight the first thing is the Ku Klux Klan's happening. They're given their second rise in Indiana, especially. It's the largest, it's one of the largest Klan organizations in the nation. And the Klan targeted and discriminated against Jews, Black Americans, immigrants, and Catholics through intimidation, hate crimes, and political influence. And so, the idea of a new life, a fresh life coming into America sometimes wasn't always the case. And German Jews had to deal with that during, this time as well. And then the second thing is the Great Depression. That's probably the big thing at the end of the 30s or at the end of the 20s when the market crashed in 1929. And it kind of exposed major weaknesses in the American economy. The depression, or I guess the crash, more so affected the 1%, but the depression itself really affected the middle class and lower classes. So at this time, the average income was $1,000 a month, which is pretty low. And then at the height of the depression in 1933, 24.9% of Americans were unemployed, which is about 12 million people. So again, these two things are affecting German Americans, German Jewish Americans at the time. And so the Jewish community in Indiana has deep roots. The first coming over to Indiana in 1840 with the first congregation establishing in Fort Wayne in 1848. German migration was at its highest in the 1860s. And then it kind of tapered off around World War I, especially with anti-German sentiment that comes up during World War I. So communities can be found all across Indiana. I think while I've been being in Jewish studies, I think that's very surprising to me. So all the way from Michigan City to Madison to Terre Haute and Ligonier. So all corners of the state. And then once we get to 1933, the US population of Jews living in the United States is about 4.3. 1940, you see a rise up till 4.8. And then specifically Indianapolis, we've got 360,000 people living in the city. And then there's 10,000 Jews that are in Indianapolis in 1930. So a decent size community in Indianapolis. While Indiana was heavily settled by German immigrants and the population in Indianapolis was still heavily German, there are, once you get to the early 1900s, you get Sephardic immigration, which is from North Africa and the Middle East. And so you get an even more diverse population coming in. So how do we get the Holocaust? And how does this population kind of get the information, disseminate it kind of thing? And so I think the first thing is just kind of giving some basics on the rise of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor, chancellor by President Hindenburg, July 30th, 1933. This was only 5 weeks before FDR comes into power. But from his appointment as chancellor, the Nazis wasted no time in implementing their racist and bigot-ridden ideologies. And this includes the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany, the exclusion of Jews from civil work, and then also book burnings, which might be some of the more early iconic visuals from early Nazi Germany. And so all these things are reported in our press. And so thanks to the History Unfolded project at the Holocaust Museum, we know that Americans knew about what was happening in Germany, and we're taking great alarm bells to this. We're sounding. And so even more thanks to Jill V. Simmons. She's the historian at the Historical Bureau here in town. She's actually done a blog series on Hoosiers in the Holocaust, which she really uses the History Unfolded project to investigate what Hoosiers did, what they knew, what they did during this time. And so news traveled quickly during this time, especially with, the foreign presses writing up news articles, things of that such, but also there was many political figures like diplomats also, warning our US government about what was happening. And so on the right, you can see one of the earliest gatherings of Jews in Indianapolis. They hold a symposium on the German situation, and it's organized by the Zionist district of the city, but they hear a couple rabbis they hear a couple rabbis about it, and sorry, I just got logged out of my document, so I am going to get that. So sorry. This is not good. No, it's fine. It's just Google Docs, I guess. Hopefully you guys have so many questions already. Okay, so thinking about, knowing what's happening in the early 1930s over in Germany, what do Jewish Americans specifically German Americans start doing once they learn about what's happening. So again, news continues to be reported. It slows down a little bit as news cycles do when something like a tyrannical government starts doing things, and then it kind of just tinkers off because they're still doing it. And so what you can see that there's a strong communication line between family members and relatives and friends that are still in Germany over to the United States. So you can see early types of humanitarian aid and support happening. And so one of those is immigration. Immigration starts very early for refugees. And so, and there's two different types of requirements. There's going to be requirements from Nazi Germany that's going on, and there's also United States requirements. So, but to kind of focus on the United States first, in 1924, we passed the John Reed Act, and it actually capped immigration from the Western Hemisphere about 154,000 people. And that's a big difference from the 10 million that came into the United States just a decade before World War I. So a huge cut in who can come over from Europe. And so it causes a lot of problems. This act was kind of due to isolationist ideas, the idea that Europe did that kind of harmed us. They pushed us into World War I, and now we have millions of soldiers dead from the war that we've never seen before. And the other thing is eugenic policies. So each country is going to have a quota now, and there's going to be the white countries, England, Germany, things like that are going to have higher higher quotas because the eugenics, breeding, the idea of getting ideal characteristics within a society, within a people. And so places like Turkey, Russia, things like that, Eastern Europe, they're going to have lower quotas because the United States just decides they do not want people like that. So again, it categorizes people, immigrants from country of origin rather than residency. So if a Turkish man is living in Europe or even just England, he's going to be within the Turkish quota rather than the English quota, even if he is a permanent resident. So with all that being said, it's already pretty hard. We've got quota restrictions in the United States. Once 1933 hits, getting a visa is going to be a lot harder than what maybe it was normally. And so the first thing is register on a waiting list. So this is getting your quota number from the American consulate with whatever country you're in. But specifically for Germany, once 1938 hit, the waiting list was a 2-year-long wait list. And so you were, by 1938, you were waiting a pretty long time, which decreases your chances of getting over. So once you're on that waiting list, you start gathering personal documents. This includes visa application, birth certificate, tax record, military discharge, medical clearance, police certificate, and then inventory list. So most of these documents are going to be corroborated with the Nazi officials. And if you're Jewish, you're going to have some hard times with some of these, getting them done, all those things. But inventory list is probably the biggest thing. The Nazis wanted to see what you had, not only in just the bank, but also furniture, jewelry, personal effects. And then to immigrate, you had to give that all up, which caused problems because the United States wants to see the money that you have. So what happens is now in step 3, you need to find an American sponsor. So this is where a lot of aid does come from German, Jewish Americans. finding an American sponsor means getting an affidavit. These people are going to vouch for you not being a public charge, which means you're going to get a job, you're going to be fine, you're just going to go right into American society with no type of hiccup. So at this point, people, especially if you're within like a big family, your family unit is going to put their resources together to do to kind of send this application over to the American consulate for you. So in some instances, I've seen that someone's going to sign the affidavit for you. It's going to say we're going to be able to employ you, but then there's going to be the cousin that buys the ship ticket. So again, it's just a collaborative effort at this point on the American side, which you see at step 3 and 4. The transit visas is what's going to get you through Europe. You're going to need those stamped. Number 6 is the big thing, is the interview with the American consulate. And so this is going to be, you're going to need to pass this interview. So they're going to drill you with questions. They're going to make sure all your paperwork's in order. Paperwork, some of it did expire. And so that means if you get your quota number called up and your paperwork is expired, they're only going to give you a very, very short amount of time to get those correct ones in. And if not, you're on the end of the waiting list. So again, at 1938, it is a 2-year waiting list. So it's going to be almost like a life or death situation at that point. And then if you pass that, you receive your stamped visa and you immigrate to the United States. So with that all being said, I hope it's clear that this is not an easy task to do. There's a lot of moving parts that need to happen, and especially your family is going to need to have some type of money somewhere to help you get over. And so I'm going to highlight some early efforts from German Jewish Americans. And so this first one is in the top right. The Jewish Chronicle kind of pointed out the $500 raised to help colonize the Jewish family in Palestine. This was organized by the Indianapolis Zionist District, and $500 was given, and they were settled in 1934. And so Cantor Myro Glass of Bethel Zedek, he is quoted in the newspaper saying that he hopes that the realization of this undertaking, that others in the community as well as throughout the country will be inspired to follow this worthy method to solve the pressing situation of our brethren in Germany. And so again, this is about 6 months after Hitler takes power. And so I think that this is going to be the one of the ways where money donations are going to help move people out of Europe pretty quickly. Cantor Myro Glass is a pretty world famous cantor, and he actually helped compose the Einsteiner Protest, which is the silent protest. And this is the front of the sheet music. And it was 35 cents to get that. But it was published in Hebrew and Yiddish and English in 1933. And it was a rather artistic form of protest that was happening during this time. In fact, the Jewish Chronicle says that it's the first of its kind to be published since Hitler had become a German leader. And the theme of it concerns anti-Semitism and is a heart cry. So it's a great example of, again, an artistic and different way that people engaged with what was happening. And then on the bottom right is a ticket to the Redeem a Jewish Child campaign. This was led by the Jewish Children of Indianapolis. This ticket's for 25 cents. And so you could, a Jewish child would approach you with this ticket, and you would donate. I'm not sure if it was only 25 cents. I'm sure you could probably buy a couple tickets, but that's just, again, one way that they decided to contribute to this and support the people over in Germany. The children did save one child, which was great. This was taken up by the Indianapolis Hebrew and Sunday schools. And again, it was one of the first of its kind in the United States. And it included all congregations in the city, as well as different communities, Ashkenazi and Sephardic. So a very cool example. And so as we move outside of the earlier efforts, you can see at this point in 1937, both there's a heightened sense of urgency from both American Jews and also European Jews, more desperation and letters and correspondence, things like that. So I'm going to highlight a couple stories and people that have helped during this time. So the first is Harold Wolf. He's from Wabash, Indiana. His father came from Hochstatten, Germany, and before 1865, and that family established the Bateman and Wolf dry goods store in Wabash. That store actually closed in 1980, so it was a long revered store in Wabash. So he sponsored 20 relatives by 1939, which is a very high number. I don't think I've ever seen that high of a number for sponsorships before. So again, it's I don't have too much information. The records are not clear on like how he sponsored. It could be the affidavit type of help. It could be the ship ticket, but it is he did sponsor 20. I was able to find his cousin Ben and his Ben's wife Julia in the 1940 census, living with Harold's cousin, who's Ben's brother, and they are said to have also lived in Hochstatten in 1938. So that is one family unit that I was able to see that was saved and living in Wabash at the time. So the next person is Max Landworth. Max was living in Michigan City at the time. He was born in Austria. He was contacted by Sam Glassner of Chicago in November 1937 about helping his brother Herman, or Sam's brother Herman, and then wife Esther. Esther was Max's niece. And so they had the two children, Molly and Herbert, also in Berlin. That's Molly and Herbert, looking cute as ever in the top corner. And so the first correspondent between Sam and Max was in 1937. The letter at the bottom was on March 1st, 1938. And you can just see how much Max put into helping save this family, because it says, I sent a set of affidavits of support signed by me in my name, also including the recommendations from 3 banks, from the city mayor, the superior judge, and the prominent citizen and other prominent citizens. Also gross income tax receipts, real estate, property receipts, insurance on property, and everything notarized by the notary public. Between the 2 years, they had some problems getting the papers kind of approved by not only the American consulate, but also different refugee services at the time. And so his wife, Molly, who was a Russian Jew at the time, she was also recruited to send in an affidavit as well. And so thankfully, they got their visas. So the same date that letter was written by Max and sent, Max received a telegram from Herman in Berlin, saying, visa received, 1,000 thanks to you, letter follows, yours truly, Herman. So they actually were able to get to New York in late March 1939. And so it's a very successful, good story of help. So the next one is going back to Indianapolis. The Jewish Welfare Drive in 1939 raised money for the United Jewish Appeals for refugees and overseas needs. They averaged about 300 volunteers. These volunteers would get into groups and they would kind of go survey the city, ask for donations. And so they repeated this in 1941 and they raised $161,000, which was very impressive at the time. Again, the leader of it, the leader of the whole drive, William Schloss, whose grandparents were German, stated that the success reported from other communities are particularly heartening in as much as they indicate the awakening of American Jews to the enormity indicated of their responsibility for saving from the complete destruction millions of Jews, resettling them in other lands and making productive citizens of refugees arriving in this country. Indianapolis can and must raise its quota for other help means difference between life and death to those over there. So again, another successful monetary drive of those who felt the need to go out into the community and get other groups of people involved as well. During this time, early refugees from Germany arrive, and sometimes those their initial placements and relatives aren't as helpful as they might have wished. And so Indiana became a big resettlement for refugees already in the United States. And so Mary Rosenberg, she was born in Vienna in 1919. She arrived in New York City in 1938 with the support of two of her uncles in the city. Unfortunately, both uncles expressed very little interest in Mary, and they actually exploited her as their employee with her time and money. And so she was a stenographist. And so she requested a resettlement from the Refugee Service organization, and Fort Wayne was determined to be the correct placement. And so there was multiple German Jews of Fort Wayne that were helping within this this move. And then the same goes with Sydney Worrell. She came to America in 1938 with her son Fred from Leipzig. She unfortunately, because of the Nuremberg race laws and the component of race mixing that was in that law, she had to divorce her husband, who was non-Jewish. And so there was an agreement that he would come over once he was able to. And while I don't know if he was able to come over at all, she was able to start a life here. But she had a hard time adjusting, her and Fred. And so they transferred to Fort Wayne in 1941, and she put Fred into some Jewish schools, which was a hallmark of Fort Wayne Jewish life at the time. And so national and international refugee operations held Fort Wayne in high esteem, and how they were handling the situation, helping. But unfortunately, Fort Wayne did have some anti-immigrant and pro-German sentiment to it. And so in a letter from the Fort Wayne Refugee Office in 1939 to a Mr. Hyman, they wrote, "The population is 70% German descent, and the best newspaper here is owned by a German family. They're absolutely pro-German and are not hiding it in their editorials or in flashing news that comes from Germany favorable to the Germans. We feel we must be careful on how we handle the refugee problem. In a small town, everything is noticed. We have about 12 refugees, and the news has already been spread that Jewish employers are replacing the Gentile help with Jewish refugees." And so while juggling all this type of wanting to bring over family, getting to that spot, refugees still coming over had to deal with, the idea of discrimination and having to deal with an organization having to deal with this type of these rumors, these people. It was hard at the time for them. So with all that being said, we'll move on to 1941 to 1949. And so immigration to the United States stops in October 30th, 1941. The United States consulate and then in Germany, and then all occupied Nazi nations stops. And so places like NGOs, consulates, they cannot support or accommodate refugees anymore because they're not in the they don't have any jurisdiction anymore in the country. So especially NGOs and humanitarian organizations, their hands are also tied. So you only see during this time immigration happening from Lisbon, Portugal, and like Casablanca, the port cities where people are already at. That's where exiled governments almost kind of go to keep kind of connection with those people that do need the help. So, and then by 1942, we get reports of mass murder and gas chambers in Europe. And so you see in April 1942, the rabbis of Indianapolis calling special service to, quote, renew spiritual strength during this time. And then 4 months later in August, you see we get the Regner telegraph, which is the confirmation of the final solution that the Nazis had planned at a conference in Germany. So at that time, again, hands are tied. Not a lot of refugees are coming over. It's kind of just a waiting game at this point. And so again, you see that spiritual renewal in many instances. But there is one story I'd like to tell. So the Heller family is from Germany. They were living in Vienna at the time of immigration. And so the Fort Wayne office was contacted by Nicholas Brazy of Lima, Ohio, on behalf of his cousins, 17-year-old Sally and 13-year-old Ruth in Vienna. With the joint help between Mr. Brazy, who was a German in Ohio, and then Polish-born Jacob Finkelstein, who was the head of the Fort Wayne Federation, they were able to get Sally and Ruth over September 1939, and they arrived in December of 39. And so this is right at the time where the Nazis invaded Poland. So war did break out, and they were able to get out of Europe. On the left, you see the National Council of Jewish Women. This is Sally's space card, which is what you received as an immigrant at the time. And so there's a lot of different details that you can see. She was admitted on quota. So the quota X is on the right. So that means her quota number had come up, and that's why they were able to get them over. And then Sally's 17 at the time and Ruth's 13, so very young. And they're coming to Fort Wayne to be settled. But a year later, they got a letter from Joseph Heller, which is Sally and Ruth's dad, asking for help. It's undated, but I can kind of tell that it was around June 1940 when they received it. And so that middle paragraph says, since my wife and I are very homesick for our children, I'd like to ask if it wouldn't be possible for you to send us an affidavit too. We have the assurance already that my children will be no burden on you. And I can also assure you that as far as my wife and I are concerned, you will not have to take care of us either. You would really do a good deed if you were enable us to join our children. And so again, you can see his address down there in Vienna. But unfortunately, from from this letter from June 13, 1940, you can see the birth dates and the place of birth for Joseph and his wife, Rosa. And unfortunately, I found 2 records on the Yad Vashem central database of Shoah victim names that match their description. And so Joseph's is on the top right. His birth place and date match while they were on transport 42 to Theresienstadt. And then Rosa is down at the bottom. Her year of birth matches, but that's the same transport. And so you kind of can infer that that is the couple and that they were taken on the same transport. Theresienstadt was a ghetto in Czechoslovakia, but it was by 1942 a holding spot for further transport to Auschwitz. And so it doesn't say that they were at Auschwitz, but we can kind of again infer that that was their final destination and eventual murder. And so a story of a broken family, which happened a lot. The United States favored children immigrants rather than adults because children didn't really have, they had time to grow up and be American. Parents were going to be a little bit more, or at least it was perceived that they were going to be a little bit more harder to make American or make a new life here. And so that is the Heller story. But apart from, the tragic stories, German Jewish Americans were also doing immense amount of work during this time. You saw a big pivot and redirect in types of aid that they were doing. The biggest one was probably military service. A lot of Jewish men enlisted and served. You also saw a lot of money directed towards war bonds and the war effort. Adoption inquiries, I found a lot in the archive. And so this is people asking if the babies and the children that came from Europe were up for adoption when they were in their homes, their orphan homes, but there was things that were stopping. American law stops you from adopting a child like that. And then once the war ends in 1945, you see further immigration help from survivors that are now in displaced persons camps across Germany and across Europe. And so again, you see stories of family members reaching out, asking for affidavits, and you do see successful immigration after the war. The United States actually became the biggest Jewish population after the war, and it did keep growing once that DP camp refugees came over as well. So, so some closing thoughts. German American Jews aided and saved a lot of European Jews at this time between 1933 and 1945, and then it went further beyond. The effort did not just stop there. And while their aid was a lot of monetary support, I think it was characterized by a compassion and responsibility during this time. And so their dedication to saving so many lives, I think, is a hallmark of German Jewish experience during the Holocaust in Indiana. And so I hope this presentation was educational for you, but I also want to challenge you intellectually as we look to today's refugee crisis. All over the world, such as Afghanistan and China and Myanmar, the lives of so many are threatened by tyrannical and genocidal governments and organizations. And so I hope the stories that I've told you today can kind of teach us and inspire us to engage those facing discrimination and poverty and fear and terror in their homelands in our lifetime, but also I think in our own communities as well. And so that is all I have. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yes.
I'm curious whether you've also spoken to the, the contemporary communities and how these actions are remembered today.
Yeah, I haven't. I think that is something that I'm excited to look forward to ask them, especially when those people are going to be the ones that benefited from the aid of these people. And so I haven't, to answer your question, I haven't, but I'm looking forward to asking. So yes.
In your talk, I appreciated that you started by talking about who the German, who the Jewish, but I was interested, a few times you said German Jewish Americans or Jewish German Americans, and I was wondering how you came to frame that group, if that was sort of interchangeable in their own terms of their own identities in the 1940s, or how you get to what they're called and how they more strongly identify.
Yeah, I noticed that most of the sources say German Jewish. I think, and what I kind of talked about before, I think it would be good to see it as interchangeable, especially as people interpret their identity. They might be considered more Jewish, they might be more German, things like that. And so at this time, I do see an emphasis on the Germanness of people. Especially when German populations during this time are rather very much I don't necessarily like the word assimilated, but they are very much connected into the community rather than, say, Sephardic communities that are immigrants of color, especially they're going to be more of that like Jewish identity that's going to be pulled from a lot of contemporary society at the time than the Jewishness of it. So I don't know if that helps. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Yes.
Let's see,
Oh.
within the Jewish community here, elsewhere, there were different communities, sub-communities, particularly after the, as you noted, the arrival of the non-Ashkenazi Jews, the Eastern Jews that spoke primarily Yiddish, and had much different cultural orientation than the German Jewish population. So is there, did you notice how the Jewishness was brought forward more by the Shoah and the persecution of the Jews abroad? The fact that that brought the people together more, I think Hendelman talks about that in her book.
Yeah, I think the two instances that I did see a coming together of different ethnic groups, especially in the Jewish community, was those drives and those services. So it seemed to be a lot within the spiritual community that that spiritual element kind of brought everyone together. As well as the drive that I talked about in 1939 and 1941. They had like 22 men's teams, they had 15 women's teams, and then they had a Sephardic team. And so those people, that's like a 10, like each team was like 5 to 7 people. And so you saw there was an inclusion of getting the whole community active in this. There was a focus on the persecution of German Jews in Europe. We later, I think, there was a later information came out that, Italian Jews were getting, persecuted. They were getting transported different areas that maybe affected that Sephardic Jews were coming from. And so to kind of round out that thought, I think that I think the show did bring some communities together, but I wouldn't know like the full extent of what that was at the time. So
I was interested in the pictures you showed of the information about settling the Jewish child in Palestine.
yes.
Do you know any more about that child or that campaign, or is it just those little scraps?
It was, yeah, so a lot of the times they were just, the Jewish Chronicle is not digitized. And so those sources came from a scrapbook from Myro Glass. And so many of the times he's kind of highlighted as doing the music, things like that. The children's names and the family's names were not normally disclosed. It was kind of like we saved a family, cool, like not much was else said was in the newspaper. And the other thing is that they weren't coming to the United States, they were going to Palestine. And so I think there was kind of we don't really need to know the name because we've done the work. But again, this is just from newspapers, so they might have disclosed it within different community settings otherwise, so. Yes.
So at the beginning, we were talking about determining who's German. You said something about like the music being part of how you determine who's Jewish. Could you like explain more of that? I'm a music therapist, and so I was just like, that's interesting to me.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on music, but you do see a lot of Jews at this time using music, especially religious, people kind of connecting back to ways of kind of centering themselves, especially during like a hard time, just kind of like what we all do with music. I'm sure that it kind of brought a comfort to a lot of people. But the Einsteiner Protest was played through the airways as well. And as well, there was a couple articles about it being played in synagogues as well. And so I think that, again, it was produced in Yiddish, it was produced in Hebrew and also in English. And maybe there was a German version as well at the time, but I think it was, again, more of like that spiritual renewal that was later talked about for a lot of the community. But again, I'm not an expert on music, so I'm sorry, I wouldn't know the further explanation for that.
We're also making a broader point about the I think we often maybe think of Judaism as a religious practice,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of the Holocaust and German policy, then it was a culture and a nationality.
Yeah.
So your definition has
Yes.
who people eat, the music they play, the language they speak.
Yeah.
Beyond practicing.
Yeah.
It reminded me when you said that I spent a semester in college back in the Soviet Union, and I was really surprised that people's passports or their identity cards and their passports, that everybody had a set of nationality in a communist country where there was no of religion. Jewish people's passports have cards set under nationality set Jewish.
Mhm.
My 20-year-old mind.
Yeah.
That was very surprising.
Yeah, and you actually saw, and yeah, to go off that point, you do see Hebrew or Jewish as a country of origin during this time. So a lot of refugees are considered Hebrew German or Hebrew Austrian, whatever it is. And so you do see that. But that is an interesting point that the Soviet Union also did that during that time. Yeah. So yes.
I have an archival-based question.
Mhm.
We talked about it, Brennan left in American newspapers are often focused or utilizing German language. Script, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes the advertisements might have English. In rare cases, maybe some Yiddish. What German Jewish, the Indiana Jewish American, like what languages are they using? And then also, have you looked at how the German, you mentioned that in Fort Wayne, I think one of the papers is owned by a German. How are they speaking about this community? Because it seems like there's tensions there. I was just wondering what you come across if you have,
Yeah.
what languages are being used and then how, how is the German community that is aligning itself across Germany?
Mhm.
Just been seeing more, in some cases, maybe embracing.
Yeah, I haven't taken a look at it. I actually, when I saw that, I was like, I wonder what newspaper and whether it's still kind of running or like if it has that like that pivoted during this time. But during this time, there was the Indiana Jewish Chronicle, and then also the Jewish Post coming out of Indianapolis. I believe the Chronicle was a little bit more Zionist, like religious leaning. And then the Post was more of just like a broader Indiana newspaper. And so I didn't see much of like different languages being used during that time. But it's an interesting thought of having, especially in a semi-small town of Fort Wayne, having pro-German a newspaper like that, and then also having a very active Jewish community kind of combating Nazi Germany policies at the time. So it's a great question. I'm excited to look and see what that answer is. So
I always do more research.
yeah, yeah. So yes.
You focused a lot on the kind of financial efforts of the Nazi community. I think is the one that
Mhm.
could you tell if that only came from the German Jewish community, or if they also focused on like including community and like what their response was?
Yeah. So there's definitely collaboration between German Jews, the Sephardic community when I guess included, I guess you could say. But Jill Wies's blog post, she does a really good job of kind of detailing what non-Jews are doing at the time as well. And you can see some help being contributed to this, but it's definitely not as much as the Jewish communities are doing at the time. And the campaign that I saw, the campaign that I highlighted, the Jewish children one, they did say that they went to the whole community. So that's going to be something where, you get knocking on the door and it's a just child asking for money. So you would assume that contributes, but it does, at this time, it does seem like a pretty close-knit community. And so I think that the money is generated within it to get the kind of numbers and the help that we see. Yes.
Did you find a lot of material, editorials or whatever, like against bringing in more refugees? Because the United States after World War I was really very isolationist, and nothing more to do with the European situation and so on. There was a lot of resistance, as I understand it, to helping refugees and so forth, and getting involved with that European situation again. So did you find
Yes.
a lot of that stuff?
Yeah, there was a national poll done, and I believe in late 1930s, and about 67% of Americans had said that they, regardless of political circumstances within countries, they wouldn't want immigrants to come to the United States. So that's a rather large number. But yes, you do see, especially with Congress enacting those types of laws, you see public figures like Charles Lindbergh, who's very staunch anti-Semite, getting on airways types of things, and doing things specifically for Jewish communities, but also that includes the immigrant community at the time as well. And so, yeah, it was just, the United States was definitely not a welcoming place at the time, with other than those communities that are helping people kind of come over. So. Any other questions?
Thank you, Ellie, again.
Thank you.